Okay, 3:30, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those in the room, if you want to go ahead and take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have 3 agenda items between now and the reception. We are not going to take any more breaks between now and the reception. And we're going to start with, we've invited and we're happy to have Carl Linville from the EIM governing body here to just give an update on the EIM governing body. And we asked a specific question about potential for governance review. Hear from Carl about that.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me well? Yeah, even at the back? Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. It's really fascinating to hear these conversations. It's educational for us, and this is very valuable for us. So thank you for having this forum. I did want to focus on kind of next steps in governance with the energy imbalance market. Governing body, basically where we are right now is, there's the thing that everybody wants to talk about that's a little bit out in the future, which is the EDAM. We're not there yet. We're not really ready to talk about the governance changes since that itself is not yet defined. Then it's kind of hard to enter into a conversation about how it would be governed until kind of go through the steps of identifying exactly what it is. So while there will definitely be a governance discussion around EIM governing body primary authority under EDAM, while we are looking forward to that discussion and active in that discussion, that's a little bit down the road. So is there a need? Is there a need for a governance discussion now, or in the first part of next year, or do we just wait until EDAM takes shape and then we do the overall governance review that the charter requires by 2020? And so I'm just going to provide my thoughts. This is an active discussion where nothing has really been decided yet. One thing that has been decided is that to the extent that changes are proposed, there will, of course, be a stakeholder process around that, and we'll look forward to all of your input on that process. So in the near term, what makes sense, and as I think about this, if I put myself in your shoes, there's some attractiveness to waiting and doing all this stuff at once, to have one grand discussion of governance revision, and also put off the obligation for providing comment and thinking through some things in advance of that time. But to the extent that there are kind of discrete items that make sense to address, that improves our operation, clarifies our authority, then maybe it makes sense to start stepping forward in a couple of ways. So the initial place, or the place that kind of the most discrete, segmentable piece of our governance that we've had some, I won't call them challenges exactly, but just kind of learning about, is this whole initiative designation process. What will fall under our primary authority? while the transition committee, provided, I think, very, solid foundation for that designation process to happen, there has been some confusion. And this, so-called but-for test, would we be considering this but for the EIM, actually has in a way been a little bit limiting. I think it maybe doesn't require or doesn't allow for our primary authority to be applied in every situation where we think we have, should have that primary authority. So now I think we've worked this out. I mean, it's not something where there've been knockdown, drag-out fights where we haven't been able to come to resolution on these things. It's just that it takes time and effort to take things on a one-by-one initiative basis if you don't have a clear definition or designation process. So it may well be that it's worth taking this on relatively soon, just so we clarify our authority, hopefully give ourselves and you all some reassurance that our authority is strong and growing, and then also clarify how initiatives are sorted to make that more efficient. So what doesn't make sense is then to allow that to kind of creep into a whole lot of other governance discussions, which then cause you to have to become engaged in a much more complicated initiative process. So even on this, most discrete, most segmentable kind of change, definitely will be the opportunity for stakeholder input in detail on that. And if it's decided that, if we were to hear back that, this is not necessary to do this now, it'd be more efficient to do it later, there are different ways of doing this, then it's not a done deal that we'll go ahead and make some changes on. Then there's also the matter, so anyway, I think that one is interesting in that it offers the opportunity to both, allow stakeholder input on a kind of relatively narrow, well-defined definition of our authority, allows us to clarify and assert our authority, and that kind of thing could be useful and not too burdensome to stakeholders. Then we know that this EDAM process is coming, where we're going to have a long discussion and significant consideration of new authorities for the energy imbalance market governing body. So, is there something in between that? Are there other issues? And again, my thought on this is that to the extent that there are issues that help us to efficiently set the stage for the EDAM discussion, and I'm being intentionally vague about this because I don't want to get into details, but if there are examples of governance revision that you think or that we collectively decide are useful to go ahead and make that will actually set the stage for the consideration of the more comprehensive review with the EDAM review, then maybe some of those things are worth taking up as well. But then again, we have this trade-off: being mindful of is it worth it? Is the very mindful of the stakeholder obligations in the coming year to provide input on many important initiative processes. So very mindful of the thought that, well, we don't want to overburden that, but on the same side, if there's a way of setting the stage that clarifies our authority up front in anticipation of EDAM, then maybe it's worth it, and that's worth a discussion having, at least briefly, to think that through. So anyway, that's pretty much what I have to say about where the governance discussion is at this point. Let me just look at my notes here to make sure I covered everything. Oh, and an ancillary issue, so not directly related to governance, but something that I'm concerned about is this issue, or something that I think we need to be working on, is this issue of ensuring that there's EIM entity and regional participation in important initiatives which may not be primary to the EIM, but may be setting the stage for some definition around the EDAM, where it's really important that we get those regional perspectives represented in the stakeholder initiatives. So I'll just say that it's something that I'm concerned about, and I am open to suggestions for ideas that you might have of what we can do to make sure that that possibility and that process is as straightforward as possible for you all to be weighing in on things which may not be technically EDAM, but may be sort of an integral part of setting the stage for EDAM. So, anyway, with that, that's what I had to say, and happy to take questions or discuss other issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. So I'll ask a couple of questions while we wait for someone in the room. Can you give us a sense, I have kind of a couple of different questions, of timeline, both I think you have to do a governance review by a certain time, and how you'll go about the process of making the decision of whether you'll do a governance.
So I believe the governance review is required by 2020. So we could wait and do everything as part, in one package as part of the whole EDAM revision that will need to happen should that initiative process go forward and meet that deadline. And what I was trying to suggest is there may be a reason for getting started earlier than that on specific issues. So I think we're contemplating taking stakeholder input on starting much earlier than that, but continuing the discussion on through checking all the boxes of all the initiatives that have impact on governance that we would want to roll into that review.
So I'm going to get specific just to be sure I understood that. So if a review by 2020, the current calendar suggests there's this EDAM feasibility that's done by mid, thinking the balance of 2019 would take on the governance if the EDAM feasibility says yes. Is that right? And you may start something sooner than that would just continue throughout the year to take on additional aspects?
So it may start earlier than that to take on initial aspects that are kind of foundation setting. And then as far as when it would start, I don't think that, has really been start then or later, like in the fall. I'm not sure.
I have one more follow-up, sorry. And did you say you'll take stakeholder input on when you should start or once you start?
I didn't say. What I was trying to say was that that any revisions that so I think what we would probably, or at least and I'll speak for myself, what I would like to know is how do stakeholders feel about this kind of staged process? Is that so burdensome that really you don't think that the juice is worth and that you'd rather wait and do the whole thing at once a little bit later, or I think in terms of when the review happens, so that's what I was saying. I think we're receptive to thinking about what's the best way for stakeholders to have an opportunity to provide input into this. Is it in a staged manner or in a comprehensive manner? Either way, there will be ample opportunity.
I know we don't want to get into the EDAM governance conversation, but at just a very high level, one interplay I could see with the classification issue that might make it problematic to sort of segment that out and deal with it separately. So I've heard CAISO statements to the effect that EIM real-time only will continue to be an option, and you may indeed have limited participation, those who choose to join day ahead as a subset of the current EIM entities initially. So theoretically, that's 3 footprints: the full CAISO balancing area, and those of us who belong as full member participants in the market, the EIM day-ahead market participants outside of the balancing area that have a different subset of responsibilities, and the EIM real-time only participants. So theoretically, the classification scheme for that would have to evolve to designate which initiatives pertain to which footprint. I'm throwing that out there only to suggest that I understand there's challenges either way, but waiting to see at least the broad outlines of what the day-ahead market structure might be and plays, or how they choose to play, will have a bearing even on the classification. So I'm not sure it's as easy to segment even that small issue, which is not that small.
Okay.
Are there questions in the room? Other questions?
I do have one reply. Just.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I was a math major, so I like consistency. so if no matter how this evolves, it doesn't. If what you're saying is true, that you can't achieve consistency without doing it simultaneously, then that would be a pretty strong argument for saying you should do it simultaneously. But if you can achieve consistency sequentially, then why not? But again, open to all sorts of thoughts.
For people that have an interest in tracking this, what's the best way for them to track and follow the governing body's kind of thoughts on this?
Well, we have a meeting tomorrow, and so, and I imagine that there'll start to be things coming out soon about requests for stakeholder input on these things, and so I just look at the Western EIM governance page and look for these announcements.
Do we have a question in the room? Comment in the room?
Tony Braun for CMUA. At the risk of thinking out loud, I think that my initial thoughts that I would try to dissuade you from doing things piecemeal. The willingness of stakeholders to agree to a particular treatment of issue A might be highly affected by their treatment of issue B, right? And then there's just old-fashioned horse trading when you get into these issues of trying to craft a compromise proposal. So I think the harder issue is, do you wait for EDAM, or do you just get going? And so there's no clear answer in my mind to that, but it may not be coming. So you do have a charge pursuant to the governance documents at one point in time.
Thank you, Carl.
You're welcome.
I did not actually, are there comments on the phone? I did not ask. Questions or comments on the phone?
Nothing on the phone at this time.
Okay, now we're going to transition to a briefing on market power mitigation. And I think folks recall, I believe it was our June meeting, we had a conversation with another market monitor that kind of shared their style and approach to market power mitigation in other markets, and wanted to, at that point in time, we said we would have the ISO come and talk about their approach to market monitoring and market power. Eric Hildebrand here to do that for us.
And as Therese mentioned, this session we're coming back to talk about two things, and I've really segmented my presentation in two parts. First, market monitoring, and they're two distinctly different things: market monitoring and market power mitigation. I think most of the presentation at the June meeting fell under the market power mitigation category, and I think kind of the theme of my presentation is market monitoring is really a process. It's a set of specific duties and responsibilities that whatever the independent market monitor for that RTO has. It's largely prescribed by FERC, fairly specifically. There's differences between ISOs, how they go about that, but they're more alike than they're different when it comes to the process of market monitoring, and I think that stems back to the FERC requirements for that. Market power mitigation, however, is really the set of rules, the set of ISO rules that are in place in every RTO to mitigate potential market power in gaming. It's very important to remember those are rules as part of the ISO. The market monitors don't make those rules. The ISOs make those rules. The monitor can obviously make recommendations, but that is part of the rules. So that's kind of how I structured my presentation. A couple disclaimers. So I have a lot of slides. They're in ascending order of technical complexity. Some of the ones on market power mitigation, I included them in case we want to get into some of the details of how our market power mitigation process works. On market design, the other disclaimer is my understanding is we're not supposed to get into ongoing ISO processes here too much or here. So I guess there are an ongoing initiative on market power mitigation, but to the extent I can clarify the current system and the current approach that we use in California, that's what I'm prepared to do, and that's what a lot of the slides are designed to do at the end. With that, so FERC actually in Order 719, I like to start off with this. It actually, requires that every ISO have a mission statement for its independent market monitor. It describes what that should be, includes protection of consumers and market participants, and by the identification, reporting of market design flaws and market power abuses. Indeed, that is incorporated in the ISO's tariff, Appendix P, which outlines the Department of Market Monitoring's duties. They've actually embellished that and clarified that it's our duty to provide independent oversight and analysis of the ISO markets. And I'll get into a little more about what that independence means to us. So FERC in Order 719, and then these are, of course, embedded in the tariffs of all RTOs. There's really 4 core duties that every market monitor has. And the first is to review and report on market performance and issues. On these, we are required, the only reports we're required to do are quarterly reports and an annual report. I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with some of the quarterly and annual reports. We do additional reports. And to me, though, while that's really kind of the core, that's really the product of a lot of the day-to-day monitoring and market analysis that we're doing. We do try to address issues that we identify that I think are important, and to try to be responsive to issues that participants are asking questions about. And to me, the fundamental purpose there, the goal is transparency to the market. It's not just reporting for the sake of reporting. It's providing transparency to market participants and hopefully instilling some confidence in regulators and market participants that the market is being watched and performing efficiently. The second main duty then is to evaluate existing and proposed market design rules and provide recommendations. But the ISO ultimately determines what rules are filed at the FERC. So again, the ISO is or all market monitors are strictly advisory when it comes to all ISO market rules. Third is to notify the FERC's Office of Enforcement when a participant or the ISO has engaged in conduct that may require investigation. We actually spend, when things are going well, less time doing this, and we like doing the first two items up there a lot more. We find that a lot more interesting. But the third one is one of the duties that often stems from our review of the markets. And the process by design is there's a lot of confidentiality. That's by design, by requirement. But I can say that we have not had any issues with respect to IM so far. We're quite a few years. From that perspective, I think everything's going. And again, I mentioned that because there's not a lot of transparency out there on that process or what happens. There's a fourth function that market monitors may do. They're not required to do it. They can do it on behalf of the ISO or with the ISO, and that's to prepare some of the inputs to market power mitigation. Those would be the kind of, we call them default energy bids. Other markets call them reference bids, but they're some of the bids used in mitigation. And I'll go into that in another slide, the role that we play at the California ISO in that. We're an internal unit of the ISO, so there are two models. You can be an external or an internal market monitor. We work closely. One of the big benefits, I think, of an internal model is we have access to all the data and the people, more importantly, to analyze and kind of the ISO markets. We are independent from ISO management as required by FERC. We are overseen by a committee of the ISO board. I do, as I have discussed with that committee, our job is to provide our independent recommendations to the board. It's not to support necessarily what management or the board ultimately files at FERC. One of the things FERC has clarified recently is that they do want market monitors to file comments at FERC and kind of not stop after the stakeholder process is done, but go ahead and file comments, pro, against, or just informational together with the ISO's filing. And then finally, we do communicate closely with FERC, state regulatory commissions, and the EIM governing body. So in state commissions, obviously we have a longer relationship with the California Utility Commission. They're a larger commission. They have quite a bit of experience in energy markets. We are reaching out to the commissions in the EIM states. We'd like to build up a relationship with independent source of information for the state utility commissions. And likewise, we do meet with the EIM governing body and want to be viewed as a credible independent source of information for the governing body. So I mentioned we do work with the ISO to develop inputs to mitigation. We primarily work on the ones that require some kind of customization or negotiation, some kind of review of costs, and then something to set up, something that's not standard. And we do that on behalf. We have the lead in doing that at the ISO because it does fit with a lot of the skills in our group. But the ISO has complete authority over what is ultimately market. So they're involved with that if there's any kind of disagreement or issue at hand there. And then I just listed there the inputs. They include the major maintenance adders, customized O&M values, and ones we call them negotiated default energy bids. They're called reference bids in other markets. Those do include opportunity costs. I think one of my last presentations in Seattle or Portland, I went into the way we do that. I do think we have we're beyond what other market monitors do with opportunity costs, because we do have more experience with hydro. Being in California, we have more experience with hydro resources, special fuel costs. The next slide, I just put in an example. This one I don't think I'll spend much time on, because most of these are actually subject to some kind of ongoing market design or market process at the ISO. But these are the kind of, if you look at our website and look under these, we list our comments, and we are very actively involved. And I listed 4 here that came to mind, which would, I think, be most important to you folks. I'll mention one. It's not the subject of an ISO process. It's FERC Order 831 actually requires all ISOs to raise the price cap to up to $2,000. It would be for import bids. So they could be bids up to $2,000, and they wouldn't be subject to any kind of cost verification. And we think that has that really stemmed out of some issues back east with the Eastern ISOs, but it's a national order, and unless ISO takes action, it would need to implement that. And that's an example of a recommendation. It wasn't on the ISO's agenda, and we're working to get it put on the agenda, because it would require a filing to keep the price cap the way it is. So now, turning to, I guess, should I stop there? Should I go through, or
I think go ahead and keep going.
Keep going? Okay. Turning then to market power mitigation in the EIM. So I think it would be good to just kind of back up and remind everybody why do we have market power mitigation in the EIM. Most EIM entities are basically one integrated utility that is, both the supplier and the buyer in the EIM area. So you might ask, well, why do you have to have market power mitigation? They're basically that would be within their own service territory, and it really goes back to FERC. FERC, and if you read some of the market-based rate filings of EM entities, they are always concerned about third-party transmission customers. That can be a small load-serving entity, independent generator, renewables. They rely on the EM area for imbalance energy service. So that's kind of where FERC is coming from, and you can trace the requirement for mitigation back to that. Most participants do have to file for special EIM rate authority within their own area. They may have market-based rates in the West, but not within their own area. So I think it's been established. But I think there's now kind of a good formula for getting market-based rates before you even enter EIM. I think one of my other presentations touched on that. The key to that often is showing that you have enough transmission to import power from other areas to ensure a competitive market within your area. So again, transmission is really the best antidote or solution to potential market power, and it really can remove the need for mitigation to even be in effect or to be triggered. As we talked about here, there's no must offer obligation in the EIM, but you must offer enough. So that just kind of plays into units aren't subject to mitigation unless they're offered, but there is this minimum requirement that you need to offer in. So I think that's where some of the issues that have. And of course, we want as much capacity to be offered in as possible. So at a high level, mitigation in the EIM is based on the same dynamic mitigation approach that the ISO developed 10 years ago. And it is really, I call it dynamic because it is only triggered when there's a couple conditions occur. The first is that an area is isolated by congestion from the rest of the system. And then we do a test on those constraints. If that area that's isolated by congestion is structurally uncompetitive in terms of relieving congestion on that constraint, then that triggers potential bid mitigation. So it's a very dynamic approach that was developed 10 years ago and has been refined quite a bit and continues to be refined. So before digging in any deeper to how we do it in the California ISO, I mentioned we developed that approach over 10 years ago now. And the ISO stakeholders, our market surveillance committee, really looked at other models. They did look at the conduct and impact test that is used in some other ISOs, not all, but some. And it wasn't adopted. I'll go into some of those reasons, but just to a brief refresher, they call them reference level bids. We call them default energy bids. These are really supposed to represent the marginal cost, including opportunity costs of resources. So every kind of mitigation approach requires you to grapple with that question, come up with some estimate of a unit's estimated marginal cost. And as I mentioned, we have, various approaches to do opportunity costs. I think they go beyond what is done in other ISOs. And I will note, part of the other presentation, it didn't, there isn't a more sophisticated approach to doing opportunity costs in another ISO. The differences lie elsewhere in their mitigation approaches. It's not in how they calculate this reference level. So they do it. They primarily rely on a conduct test, and that's basically how if a unit bids in, how much higher is that in relation to this reference bid before mitigation might kick in. So they look directly at the bids, and then they do a second test. If that's failed, then they say, well, did that have a significant impact on the whole market, on price? So it's kind of a two-phase test. And these are from the other presentation, so the typical thresholds are $100 above cost, so this would be $100 above cost for constraints that are deemed not chronic, $10 to $100 for chronically constrained areas, so I think that would mean more the frequency of congestion, and $25 for offers resulting in uplift. So I think this may have been referring to minimum load costs or no load costs, what we call commitment costs. So what were the issues? Why was this approach not adopted 10 years ago? Some of the concerns, a big one was, that it is explicitly set up. The conduct thresholds are explicitly set up to only be triggered by a quote, substantial deviation from a competitive offer price. So that could be $100, or I guess as I note here, our concern is suppliers can bid right up to that conduct test. They know what it is. They can bid $99. They're never going to trigger that conduct test. And that's a significant deviation above a competitive price. Our view is mitigation is that when conditions are structurally incompetitive, you need to ensure a competitive price. So the impact test, which is rarely triggered, the thresholds are also high. So not only does the bid have to be quite high, it has to have quite a significant impact on the market prices as well. The areas, the differentiation between chronic and non-chronic, they have to be defined statically. That was another issue we didn't like. So they're kind of backwards looking. They're looking at congestion, and they're drawing a line somewhere, 10 or 20%. You're either chronic or not chronic, depending on the frequency of congestion. But congestion can occur anywhere on the grid, and even if, we think then if costs are $99 above, higher every time congestion occurs, that's not, it's one of the reasons this wasn't accepted. And that's kind of why we call it dynamic, because it doesn't rely on a static definition of whether an area is constrained or not. Commitment costs are only mitigated ex post, so after the fact, and only if a unit was committed. Our view on this is that wouldn't fully mitigate the impact of economic withholding. So if a unit had high, startup bids, and it didn't get dispatched, or it did get dispatched, the mitigation, as we understand it, would only occur after the fact as part of a settlement process, and the impact on the market on prices would remain, or not be unraveled in that case. So with that, I will turn back to the dynamic approach that we use at the ISO. And so again, I'll pretty much stick to describing how we do it at the ISO. There were some minor changes to adapt it to the EIM, and I think there is an ongoing process to even adapt that further for the EIM. But we first call what we call the market power run, the MPM run, and that's performed prior to the market with unmitigated bids, so all the market bids. So the idea is you get kind of one run that just says, hey, if you let everybody bid what they want, what would the price be, and where would you see congestion? So then this is all automated. Then they look at the results, and so if congestion occurs in this first run based on market bids that isolates an area from the rest of the grid, then that constraint is tested to see if it's structurally competitive. We use a 3 pivotal supplier test, which I could go into more. Basically, you take out the 3 largest suppliers and you see, could that constraint still be relieved? Is there enough congestion, enough generation to still meet load without violating that constraint? So then we do that. If it fails that test, well, that test either says it's structurally competitive or uncompetitive. If that test says that the constraint is uncompetitive, then a unit may be subject to bid mitigation. And I think one thing that's not appreciated that we do, or it's a misperception that then you're automatically mitigated down to this reference bid or this default bid, and instead, actually, we look at we go back and look at the prices from that first run, from the run with unmitigated prices, and we calculate what's called the competitive price. And it's basically everything, all the components of the LMP except for congestion on uncompetitive constraints. The idea is we're not going to mitigate you below a competitive market price, even if your marginal cost is below that market price, where that market competitive price is going to be a floor, and you wouldn't be. Then of course, then the mitigation would occur, and the mitigated, if a unit goes through that entire process and has its bid lowered, actually lowered, then that would be used in the next market run. This slide, I think I will skip over. It just goes into more detail about that. I described at a high level how we test the congestion constraint. If people are interested, I'm glad to talk about that. But we really did develop this approach to determine constraint is competitive or not. And I guess the only thing I'd point out here is, and another reason we call this dynamic is, we're summing up the actual available supply that's available at that market interval. So, it's really there's a lot of calculations involved. It's amazing they can do it, in the timeline that they have to do it. But it's really summing up what is the real demand, what is all the supply at that moment, if the market's actually seeing, which can vary, quite a bit interval to interval. So I will just point out that the test is based on actual supply and demand in that market interval. Again, this is maybe for some of you in the audience or future reference, just pointing out, kind of showing some of the math at a high level that, the way I phrased it is that, basically if a constraint is congested, it's non-competitive, and that unit, if its price is increased as a result of congestion on that uncompetitive constraint, then, and you identify that, through the shift factors, then all the set of units that can mitigate that congestion could be subject to bid. Again, we're limiting it just to that set of units. And then I mentioned the competitive LMP, so the idea is, don't mitigate down to whatever we determined as the default energy bid. I think now, as some of you that have experience with EIM, you'll see that a lot of times this competitive LMP is really, you're not being mitigated down to your default bid. Rather, this competitive LMP can be quite high at times. That's the floor that occurs in mitigation. So then I have some examples. I think I will skip these. Unless folks are interested, I could then circle back. More information. We do have, a website where most of our stuff is available on the ISO website, but it's scattered around. We have links on our website to all comments on each stakeholder initiative, issues that go to the board, issues that go to the governing body, tariff appendix P. I think that's my prior presentation on default energy bids. Guess I gave that to a group of EIM participants at the last technical workshop. And then my personal information. We're always glad to have people reach out directly. And I know actually quite a few of you, we have gotten calls. If you see something, that's part of our job. If you see something in the market and you don't understand it, or maybe it's in your settlements, that's the kind of thing to look at. And frankly, that we can look at charts and data all day on our screens, but quite a few of the things that we've found out have really bubbled up from market participants because, our problem can be too much data, and participants really scrutinize that. They have much less data, but they look at it much more closely. So we have found quite a few things. Sometimes it has turned out to be a calculational error or something the ISO software is not doing correctly. Sometimes it's just a matter of explaining to the participant. Quite difficult to understand. Or sometimes it's kind of in between as well. Things are running as planned, but maybe that's kind of an unintended consequences, and that's the kind of thing that can lead to a potential market design issue being raised. So I will stop there and entertain questions.
Questions? Thank you. Questions in the room? I always have one to start, so you guys can think about your questions. So as the energy imbalance market has expanded and it's got a bigger geography, right, than just the ISO, what role does your organization play in looking at some of the impacts to transmission customers and maybe different consequences of how it might be impacting transmission customers in different...
Well, to me, that's, one of my bullets there, that's why we focus on market power mitigation. That's why you have market power mitigation in the EIM. A lot of areas, 95% of the load in that area is, the vertically integrated utility, but there's 5 or 10% of the load. It's easier to look at load serving entities. It's harder to look at what independent generators, wind farms might use. But those are the two main kind of customers, and they rely on the EIM entity for transmission service. And that's under a FERC rate. That has to be, that's under FERC. FERC has to deem that rate just and reasonable. The EIM entities, when you join EIM, my understanding is they amend their tariff Instead they used to charge prices, and I think one of the benefits of EIM that may have been overlooked is some of the old tariffs would base Imbalance service on, day-ahead prices and some pretty crude measures or proxies. Under EIM, you're passing through the EIM price directly, so that's a good thing. They see the price signal, the wind farms, they see the price signal. They're exposed to that, but that does have to be at a just and reasonable rate. So that's why we spend a lot of time on mitigation. And I guess our theory is we want entities to have market-based rate authority. We want, when you have a lot of transmission, the mitigation doesn't kick in. And I've in other presentations that in most areas it's very small percent of the time that the mitigation's kicking in, but you do have to have it there. So that is kind of a prerequisite to have it there, and we spend a lot.
Other questions in the room? Marshall.
Eric Marshall, MP with UAMPS, and I'm not going to ask you the question you probably think, but just a mechanics question. We did submit a hotline question. What's the mechanics of the hotline? Are we ever going to receive notice that no, it solved it, or what, an official notice?
My understanding is somebody did get back to your organization.
Well, we've had conversations, but I never received a formal response.
Oh, okay. My understanding that was the response. We got back to. There was a problem. The ISO was the hotline was going off into hyperspace for a while, and so several entities, yourself, brought up an issue, involving it. Really, kind of involved then your tariff, the utilities tariff that you were being charged under. So it's kind of a gray area as far as to the extent we got involved. We did get involved in that case. In that case, your request didn't get to us right away, but I think we got a call from another participant, and that's how it eventually got addressed. So that's why I have that hotline. That's on there because I think it's required to be on our website, but we really encourage people to, email and contact us directly. I would like to get our, direct emails up on our website.
Well, like I said, my main question, I know the process, or my question is the process. When you receive a hotline question or comment, is there we have conversations, or if something happens in the future and I get a hold of you, is there a process that DMM goes through where you answer or a question or?
Yes. I would say we always respond. There's not a formal form or anything to respond. We get back. Sometimes, it can range from we had quite an extensive discussion on that issue in that case. Sometimes we refer them to the ISO. Sometimes we don't get many of those hotlines. We've got about 3. Most people contact us directly. And they range. Sometimes it'll lead to something being in our report. We'll provide some more analysis of that. Sometimes it'll lead to a recommendation. The case you're referring to, it just didn't seem like it fit. It frankly didn't fit under the ISO's tariff and market rules, and it involved another entity's tariff. But we did get involved. We had to actually look at it quite a bit. There was an element that was related to ours, and we looked at it quite a bit to, determine to the extent it did involve ISO market rules. Kind of ruled that out.
Or another question in one of your first slides, you say market monitor under FERC rule is to protect the consumer. Who does DMM look at as the consumer? End-use consumers in the EIM footprint? Or customers, which are the EIN entities?
Well, it says in-use consumers and market participants, so it doesn't just say market participants.
Okay.
To me, that it does mean end-use consumers. If you look at the Federal Power Act, I think it does talk about end-use consumers. So the goal is to get, reliable service at a lower cost to consumers. So I think it ultimately, obviously we don't deal with end-use consumers, so it means load-serving entities, but it includes all market participants. And the reason that it doesn't just say consumers is all market participants. It does buyers and sellers. The way we view it is, if a price is being manipulated, it's probably there's a buyer and a seller both ways. There might be somebody selling at that price, buying at that price, and if it involves uplift, that gets passed on to, oftentimes supply and demand. So we really view it as we want to provide a level playing field that all participants, 99.9% of them are playing by the rules and following rules. We want to have confidence that when folks are participating in the market, they know it's, it's a level playing field, and they want to know that everybody else is following rules. So that's kind of our approach on that.
Okay, thank you.
And it doesn't mean lower prices always. It's we do look at things from a market efficiency. We tend to our main criteria tends to be efficient market outcomes. A lot of times efficient market outcomes are do result in lower prices. But that's really the primary criteria we try to use as market efficiency.
Are there other questions in the room or questions on the phone?
We do have one caller on the phone. Actually, we have two callers on the phone. I'll open the first line. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Laura Trelise of PGP, and appreciate the discussion, Eric. My question was on market power mitigation and the three pivotal supplier test. I had heard that CAISO doesn't apply the three pivotal supplier test to the EIM, and was wondering, my first question is why that's the case, and my second question is what would be the catalyst for CAISO applying the three pivotal supplier test to the EIM? Would it be, for example, an entity like BPA joining the EIM? So just if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that was one of the, I think there was a very limited number of changes that were kind of needed to be made to take the ISO approach and apply it to EIM. And until now, we've had a very limited, there's only half dozen participants in EIM. So when an EIM area or areas are isolated by congestion, you're right, that software doesn't do a three pivotal supplier test. But so far, that has never mattered because it's either one or two or three areas that are isolated by congestion. I don't think we've ever seen more than three. So if the software was modified to do a three pivotal supplier test, by definition, if you have an area that consists of three balancing areas separated by congestion, and you took those three suppliers out, the test would sure not to pass. But we have flagged that as EIM grows, that would be a refinement. So if you do, if there, you get kind of regional congestion where the region is kind of split half, and you can do a three pivotal supplier test and still pass that, that would be a refinement for an approach. But again, I would point out that as a practical matter, I don't think that has ever resulted in more mitigation. Result would have been the same so far. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm thinking
was, there's going to be one area or maybe two, so that there would be no point in doing a three pivotal supplier test.
Right, that makes sense. I think what I'm thinking of.
but it's basically if you take out the three largest suppliers, you know, are you left with enough supply to meet that And so when you have one or two large suppliers in an area, you would not pass that test.
Thanks. I think what I'm thinking is, for example, a balancing authority area such as BPA might have multiple suppliers even just inside their BA. So I don't know, but it would seem like there may be a need for the three pivotal supplier tests when they join, or maybe something to analyze as they're looking at potential participation in the EIM.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good point. I didn't fully appreciate that you're saying you could have one area joining and there's actually a diversity of supply within that area. Very good point. Again, I was kind of assuming, and because all the other areas had a large integrated utility, but that's a very good point. So maybe that's an issue that needs to be dealt with, sooner rather than later. So thank you for the question and the reminder.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Just to follow up on that great question. At the same time, would you change the net buyer rules? Because with the CAISO, right, with the three pivotal supplier test, you exclude net buyers, but then with EIM, you don't. So would that necessitate, would you have to change that rule? Never understood why you actually made that rule change. So can you explain that too? Why EIM, you don't take out the net buyers?
Okay. So I think most folks in the room don't know what a net buyer is, but the California rules, so I'll back up. Originally in California, the main utilities, because they were clearly net buyers over the year, and that is actually, ISO calculates that, I think, over the year, so what is it? So when they're doing the three pivotal supplier test, they leave them in. Even though they're often the largest supplier, they leave them in. I will point out that rule results in less mitigation, not more. So to answer your question, I think it was left out. The rule was originally designed in California because there was confidence that the main utilities were all net buyers. When we were looking at EIM in the imbalance market, we decided you can't really determine that. You're a buyer one interval, a seller the next. So one was it would be not possible to determine if net buyers just in the EIM imbalance market, whereas it was possible in the ISO market, which is primarily a day-ahead market, to determine the highest level of confidence that these three large entities were net buyers. And I guess I should explain. So the assumption was they're not going to exercise market power, so therefore we're not going to take them out when we do the three pivotal supplier test. And the other reason it wasn't done, frankly, is because it would result in mitigation much more frequently, because you would be taking out a very large supplier rather than leaving them in. So basically, the assumption was they're going to be bidding competitively, so you can leave them in the test. So that's, I think, the genesis of it. There's confidence they were net buyers, and that could be determined, and it was to reduce the degree of the frequency of mitigation. So why did we change that? When you can't determine who's the net buyer, and if you didn't exclude them, you would probably trigger mitigation even more often.
We have one more question on the phone.
The other caller has exited the queue.
Any other questions in the room? Thank you very much.
Okay.
This was really interesting, and as you said, you can ask follow-up questions at any time. We're to the portion of the agenda of other issues. I'm going to invite Ryan Leonard up because he does have another issue. And while he's on his way up and we're loading his presentation, I just want to note one of the things we always do at the end of the agendas is say, are there agenda items you would like to see in the future? So about or have a conversation about. We've typically done these panel presentations where we get to hear different views, and so you can talk to any one of the liaisons and give them your grid.
Thank you. Yeah, so Ryan Leonard, Avangrid Renewables, and so this presentation I'll talk a little bit about my company and the Gen-only BA that we recently brought online, but also with a focus sector perspective of the independent power producers and power marketers as a potential pathway for some generators. So real quick, the Gen-only BA, so NERC defines balancing authorities. We typically or oftentimes will think about them as geographical things because they generally are defined as geographical things because there are load generation and transmission, but they're inside of what's called a metered boundary as defined by NERC. So a Gen-only BA is an electrically defined balancing authority, and it's defined by metered points. And I have some slides later on where I'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's kind of the distinction from your typical or so what we've been doing, and we've been working a little bit with the ISO on this as well, but is kind of reviewing the tariff and the business practices to understand what it would take. And sorry if this is a little bit small, but I will after this meeting. But it basically breaks down into 4 categories that we looked at from a tariff and business practice perspective. So the first one is implementation, and that's kind of on its own. And then it's the 3 things that really make up a balancing authority, which are transmission, load, and so from an implementation perspective, typically, or at least all of the EIM entities thus far, their implementation fees or costs have been based on net energy for load. So for those of you that have participated recently in the ISO offering RC services, these terms are probably familiar to you. And so as a Gen-only BA, we don't have any net energy for load because all of our energy is exported. We don't have any internal load. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to say we wouldn't have an implementation fee. And one potential option there would be using net generation as the variable, the value that was utilized to define the implementation fee. But in general, the implementation fee is something that can be negotiated or defined with the ISO as long as it's comparable, we think, and so that's something that we think can be overcome pretty. Then moving into the other kind of 3 categories of a balancing authority, probably the biggest one is transmission from a Gen-only BA's perspective, because typically Gen-only BAs are not transmission providers. They utilize other transmission providers' transmission. And so from an EIM perspective, though, in order for a Gen-only BA to participate, it is very likely that they would have to become an EIM transmission service provider under the tariff. Now, I have no plans. Avangrid doesn't at this time, nor would I become a transmission provider because it comes along with it a lot of responsibility, but specifically from a EIM perspective, that basically gives us the avenue under the ISO tariff to utilize our transmission rights for EIM transfers. Then moving on to load, obviously Gen-only BAs don't have a load. From a FERC perspective, Gen-only BAs are defined as balancing authorities with less than 20 megawatts of load. But in WEC, Gen-only BAs typically don't have any load. And our balancing authority, I think most of the other. And so from a load perspective, there's a lot of things that apply to load, obviously in EIM. But in evaluating those rules, it appears that the vast majority of them fall into what I would call a null set, meaning that you don't need to specifically exclude a Gen-only BA from having that provision applied, but it just naturally kind of falls out. So if you don't have load, it doesn't apply. So it doesn't appear that there would be a lot of changes that would need to occur either from a tariff or business practice perspective to cause Gen-only BAs to not be and then from a generation perspective, in general, Gen-only BAs fit pretty well into the generation aspect of EIM. one of the major areas that we've been evaluating, we talked a lot about it today, is the resource efficiency test. Avant-grid perspective, the flex ramp. So from an avant-grid perspective, the flex ramp requirement, obviously we're a gen-only, renewable-only VA. So we're going to generally live and die by the flex requirement. So we're very interested in the to how the flex requirement is calculated. So that the current histogram approach or 40-day look-back is generally not very aligned with how we currently manage our renewable fleet. But the quantile regression and ensemble approach that they evaluated with much more aligned with how Avangrid specifically looks at renewable generation. But in general, the resource efficiency test needs to be looked at very closely because it is generally evaluated inclusive of load. But from our read and take of the business practice and tariff, there's no reason why a gen-only VA couldn't otherwise. Summary, if we can, I can jump to the next slide. So in general, while gen-only VA is somewhat unique from an EIM perspective, it doesn't appear that there would be any particular tariff for sure, business practices, likely not, and therefore we would expect in the EIM through what I'll call kind of the standard implementation process. I guess I can pause there for questions on this, and then I'll talk about what our gen-only VA looks like, just as an example offer to the EIM. Okay, sure thing. So we can go to the next slide. Just in summary, so we just recently went live in July of 2018. So we're the most recent gen-only VA in WEC, but we're not the only one. I can't remember if we are the 8th or the 7th, but there are a number of other gen-only VAs out. Our VA comprises 1,300 megawatts of wind and then about 10 megawatts of solar currently. That's balanced primarily through co-located with 100 megawatts of simple cycle CTs, and then we also are active SLICE participants, hydro generation on the Mid-Columbia. Just high level, why did we do it? So it gives us improved operational flexibility and access to things that we didn't have access to before to help us manage our wind portfolio. It also gives us long-term cost certainty. So previously we were sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of Bonneville from a wind integration perspective, and now are kind of masters of our own destiny when it comes to balance. And then it also gives us a platform for growth, whether it's providing these services to other generators or even potentially someday serving load. Slide, please. So this is just kind of a graphical representation of what our VA looks like. Kind of hard to represent something in a picture but we really do sit on, all of our assets sit on Bonneville transmission in one way or another. And so we have our wind fleet, which right there is defined as a single interchange point. We actually have 5 interchange points, so effectively 5 substations that are located on Bonneville's transmission system, that 10 wind farms that represent the 1,300 megawatts. Then we also have dynamic capability with Klamath Falls, like I mentioned, and then we have a slice of Grant, and then we have acquired a slice of Chelan starting January 1st. We also transact dynamically with Tacoma, Avista, TransAlta, and Bonneville, which generally is an hour-ahead product for dispatchable capability. We will acquire the capability hour ahead and then dynamically dispatch it intra-hour to manage the next slide So just breaking it down in numbers, so the Klamath facility, the cogen, the combined cycle is a 2-on-1. The mins and maxes are up there, pretty substantial ramp rate, so a lot of capability. It's very good for balancing wind. I don't talk about it too much in here, but I guess just generally speaking, this is really how specifically I guess I would say Avangrid would benefit from EIM is, one, a decreased cost to integrate wind, right? Because sometimes our resources aren't necessarily the out there to balance the wind if we were participating in EIM. But then you can imagine when we don't have any wind, then we have a fair amount of balancing capability and would otherwise. So that's the combined cycle unit. Our Klamath peakers, like I said, are 100 megawatts. They can come online in 25 megawatt chunks and are able to be brought online within 7.5 minutes. So they are generally used for offline or supplemental reserve capability, but it's far more than our contingency reserve obligation. Power pool reserve sharing group. Our obligation is 3% of our online generation, so we have excess of that. And then we have 200 megawatts of installed capacity with Grant, and then 100 megawatts of installed capacity with Chelan. Both hydro resources have pretty significant ramp rates. And then, as I mentioned, we have dynamic capability with the other. We also, on the prior slide, it showed market. We are very active in the 15-minute market with a number of entities throughout the North. Slide. Then, so that's kind of our generation outlook. And then from a transmission perspective, these are our long-term firm transmission rights, Bonneville transmission and our transmission rights. Bonneville network, we have 776 megawatts, which is we had to pick a point on the system that generally reflects where our BA is kind of located. It would be at John Day. And then intertie perspective, we have the 852 megawatts of AC, and then also just included the fact that we applicable to EIM, but yeah, so I guess just kind of next steps for us that's not up here. We're currently doing cost-benefit analysis of EIM to evaluate kind of the economics of it. We're also, looking for the ISO in understanding if there aren't any particular hurdles in us participating. And then from a general timing perspective, we would foresee a potential of joining as early as April of 2020. And then, if all things worked out, that could be a potential date. It's kind of aggressive depending on, what we're able to figure out and when. But otherwise, I think an April time period would not be hard to meet depending on when we're able to lock down specifics on some of these issues.
Questions? So I'll ask the first question. I'll give people. So it seems that you suggested some of the benefits of the general EBA joining.
Yeah, that's a two-way street, right? So yes, so we bring transmission, but obviously all the other EIM entities bring transmission too.
And what are the barriers that you?
Well, that was that's what we've been evaluating. So that was kind of the first one is there was just initial kind of hesitation, I guess I would call it, that, well, you don't have loads, so that's a little bit different, so that may but so far, the evaluation that we've done to date has not brought up any particular hurdles. And, a major timing hurdle, obviously, as everybody would probably agree, would be a tariff modification. And Avangrid has not identified anything that would.
Well, yeah, first of all, we'd like to say that we're really appreciative of Avangrid's engagement and interest in the EIM. I would say at this time that, I've got to read my notes here because I got some official talking on it. So we really appreciate that you guys have worked with us to try and frame exactly what the structure might look like. I would say that at this time, from the ISO's perspective, we're still conducting a thorough review. But it is something that we'd like to engage the rest of the EIM entities in the discussion on. But it's something that's on the table, and we're actively pursuing.
Are there other questions in the room or questions on the phone for Ryan?
No questions at this time.
Identify yourself, please. This is Pam Scoreboard with Portland General, and I also want to thank Ryan for proactively reaching out to the EIM community to raise these issues. And I think we've all acknowledged that each EIM implementation is unique, that as the EIM grows and we find all the different challenges and unique situations for each balancing authority that does join the EIM, that each balancing authority has brought its own unique footprint and its own unique resources and challenges. And I think the ISO has worked to accommodate all that and try to create a participation framework that has worked for all the EIM participants. And so I think we're looking forward to understanding more about how a gen-only BA, what they do bring and how we can work to accommodate the unique characteristics of the gen-only BA into the EIM. And I'm glad to hear that there are no tariff barriers so far, and I hope that that remains the case so that things can proceed.
Tony Brunn for CMU8. Ryan, what does it mean for you to have a slice of the hydro resources? Are they actually electrically within your VA?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as of right now, we dynamically schedule our slice of grant. It's not pseudo-tied in yet. So generally you use what's called a dynamic transfer, which is comprised of a dynamic schedule and a pseudo-tie. So a dynamic schedule represents interchange, which is what we currently puts the resource electrically within your metered boundary, and so within our electrical boundary, and we're actively working towards bringing
actually be submitting bids for those resources into the EIM.
That's right.
Okay, any other questions? So I want to remember this time, let's thank our last round of panelists, Carl and Eric and Ryan. Thanks so much. And there is a reception following in the Fountain Courtyard Room that begins. Thanks so much for coming. And March 11th is the next meeting in Albuquerque.
Thanks for joining today's conference. This event has concluded and you may disconnect.